Practitioner, researcher, and teacher of peace and conflict studies. He holds a PhD in peace, conflict, and development studies from Jaume I University in Castellón, Spain. He focuses on a wide range of research areas, including elicitive conflict transformation, transrational peace philosophy, emerging technologies, and existential risk. He is currently a lecturer in peace and conflict studies at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. And now Noah's going to give us some comments on existential risk and peace and conflict studies.
Thank you, Sean, for that introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today with you all, and I'd like to extend my thanks to our organizer for putting this together, to my fellow panelists for giving us this opportunity to get to see what you are interested in and what you are focused on, as well as to all of our participants for joining us today. This turnout is really tremendous. But my answer to the question of what is or could be or should be included in the state-of-the-art of peace and conflict studies is a focus on the relationship between peace and long-term human survival. I feel that much has been written on the ways in which we can understand and work with the past, the ways of engaging with the present, but what is less understood or less focused on in peace research are ways of thinking about the future. And it is this question of the future which has led me to what I've been working on the last 2 years, and that is developing the initial research agenda at the intersection between existential risk and peace and conflict studies. So what are existential risks? Well, put briefly, existential risks are those that threaten the destruction of humanity's long-term potential or threaten the extinction of intelligent life on Earth. Of course, living is dangerous, so understanding risks is important. Risks can be classified by their scope, that is the number of people that would be affected, their severity, that is how badly each of these people would be affected, and their probability, how likely is this to occur. An existential risk is one of a global scale and the most fatal level of severity, where the X marks the spot. While many risks at the same scale but less severity would cause untold suffering and misery, there would be a possibility of recovery. With existential risks, there is no possibility. Now, just to give a snapshot of the scale and types of risks along with some estimates, if we look at naturally occurring existential risks, events such as supervolcanoes and meteor strikes, we can see that the estimated odds of this type of existential risk occurring within the next 100 years as 1 in 10,000. If we now shift our focus to looking at anthropogenic risks, those things that we create for ourselves, the total estimated odds are 1 in 6. Now, if we break that down a bit further and we look and we can see that nuclear war and climate change both have a 1 in 1,000 chance of causing an existential catastrophe in the next 100 years, whereas an engineered pandemic in the same time frame has a 1 in 30 chance, and even more alarming is that the threat of an unaligned artificial intelligence causing an existential catastrophe is 1 in 6. Fields of existential risk and peace and conflict studies share a common history, a normative orientation, and a transdisciplinary approach. They also operate in a similar situation of scarcity of expenditures. We all know that the amount of money that is spent on building peace versus the amount of money that's spent on contributing to conflict is greatly imbalanced. Both of these fields work on complex, intractable problems and require long-term timescales, and therefore I think they would benefit from a collaborative and ongoing effort in untangling these wicked problems. I think that collaborative research on this topic is exciting, necessary, and pressing. These are complex problems that require transdisciplinary approaches. The knowledge base needed for understanding and working on these problems far exceeds what any individual could be expected to have. And I hope that through collaboration we will find ways of conceptualizing and prioritizing these issues. As a starting point for this research, I propose 4 initial lines of inquiry for discussion at the intersection between peace and conflict studies and existential risk research. And these are great power conflicts, the intersection between peace, pandemic, and conflict, the relationship between climate change, peace, and conflict, and emerging technologies. Now, if we look at our first line, great powers conflict, this involves questions as to the likelihood of a great powers conflict occurring, the possible effects that it may have, how it may combine with other risk factors, and what options exist for peace building and conflict transformation. The question of great powers conflict is by no means new, but the context in which these dynamics are unfolding is rapidly changing. There are very real fears surrounding the ways in which such a conflict may begin and escalate. If we entertain a semi-hypothetical example, the US and China are currently in a race to develop artificial general intelligence. In the right geopolitical climate, this could combine with political, economic, and military matters, creating an increasingly dangerous potential for conflict. This then would paired with the fact that most great powers also have nuclear weapons, the level of danger increases dramatically. This, of course, is an old question, and we need to be careful about the ways in which we think of it, to avoid falling into the frames of thinking and acting, which assume that conflict is inevitable. For example, there is a term still used in policy circles today called Thucydides' trap, which refers to the conflict between Milos and Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, and is based on the assumption that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, the resulting structural stresses make violent conflict the rule, not the exception. This model is often used to describe the possibility of conflict between China and the US. Looking at these kinds of assumptions should be a call for us to assess what we know about de-escalating great powers conflict, as well as to creatively anticipate responses to it before it happens. The second of my proposed research lines is the nexus between peace, pandemic, and conflict, which of course is very much in our collective attention right now. We have seen how much of the world was not prepared for the COVID-19 pandemic, and how many of our systems have been stressed to the breaking point. In this stress, underlying inequalities, grievances, fears, and shadows have been revealed. Many of the trends that led to the outbreak of pandemics do not appear to be easy to change and would require large-scale shifts in the ways that we live and the ways that we think. The effects of large-scale violence on public health and the outbreak of disease is fairly well understood, but what is less clear, however, is the reverse: the impact on pandemics on exacerbating conflicts. Much remains to be seen and understood. At the beginning of the pandemic, the United Nations Secretary General stated his concerns to the Security Council, his well-founded fears that the pandemic could result in the postponement of elections, resulting in political tensions, that the large-scale economic fallout could be an incentive for conflict, that the pandemic may create incentives for some actors to escalate violence, that the pandemic would provide a window of opportunity for terrorism, as well as the pandemic may reveal the weakness of the global system to pathogens, thereby incentivizing bioterrorism. And finally, what will be the cumulative effect of the stalling of worldwide peace processes? At the same time, the pandemic has shown our ability to cooperate, which is an important starting point for looking at peace-building opportunities present in public health. My third research line, I think, is the most currently explored, but still deserves a lot of attention, and that is the relationship between climate change, peace, and conflict. Here we are looking at increasing our understanding of the ways in which climate change leads to conflict, and also how conflicts may exacerbate climate change. I think there is a need to realistically assess what we know about these relationships and what we do not, and to extend our analysis of climate change as a compounding factor which can exacerbate other risks. I think there is also an importance in placing our attention on how we can create incentive structures that can be used to build and maintain the trust needed for international cooperation on global problems to be the norm rather than the exception. And my final research line focuses on emerging technologies. Emerging technologies are those whose potential are not fully yet understood or recognized. They're characterized by their radical novelty, which occurs as a discontinuous innovation in method and function across different technological streams, their relatively fast growth across a number of dimensions, their persistent coherence amongst different technologies and research streams, their impacts that manifest across a wide range of social, economic, and political systems, as well as the overall uncertainty and ambiguity of their impacts, and that many of these impacts of these technologies lie very much in the future, though they depend on the choices that we make today. There are a host of transformative technologies that fall into this category, and I will be focusing on two which I see as the most pressing, the most significant leverage points. The first of these is artificial intelligence. The field of artificial intelligence stands on the edge of defining what we can do and what we are as a species. I think we're at a critical moment in its development and in forming the institutions and norms which may frame its growth and trajectory in the medium to long-term future. We have already seen the emergence of a global race for AI, but what we have not yet understood is the degree to which it will be a race to the bottom, where we will be incentivized to sacrifice safety and transparency for speed of development and control. It also remains to be seen to what degree this will become an AI arms race. And this is where questions of ethics and regulation come in, especially with regards in its use in autonomous weapons and mass surveillance, as well as how will large-scale demographic shifts related to the future of work have an effect on conflict. There are also many emerging peace-building opportunities within the field of artificial intelligence. Some of these which are already being piloted in the field of humanitarian and disaster response, and I feel that this will be a very fruitful area to place our attention on. And the last technology that I would like to focus on is biotechnology, or synthetic biology. The rapid growth in the power and access to gene editing techniques such as CRISPR-9, which allows us to edit the genome and germline of living organisms, as well as design entirely new ones, calls us to question our vision for our own genetic future. There's already precedent for extensive research into, and in some cases, deployment of biological weapons. This paired with recent gain-of-function experiments, particularly with the H5N1 virus, makes very real the possibility where the ability to inflict large-scale violence shifts from the domain of the state to that of any sufficiently motivated individual with an undergraduate level understanding of molecular biology. Peace and conflict studies is well positioned to deal with many of the paradoxical questions that arise in reducing risk in this field. For example, how do we work with the question of dual-use technologies? How do we handle information hazards inherent in trying to prevent the development of engineered pathogens? As well as how might we be able to collaborate on issues of biosecurity as an avenue for trust building and conflict de-escalation. I see these 4 research lines as an important starting point for the future of peace work and peace research. I think there is a lot more to be done on these specific topics, as well as more meta-level thinking. How do we think about these topics, especially for those for which there are no precedent or historical examples for? How can we work on these risks without falling into a myopic view where we see peace as only limited to security, but how can we keep that view open to include other dimensions? So what I'm proposing is setting a seed to ground with this research agenda, and I'm hoping to see it grow. Hopefully that this will be published in different forms and will be available soon so we can start using it as a way of facilitating conversation. And I'm looking forward to the voices and perspectives that will come to be a part of it. And if this has struck some resonance with you, I would love to get in touch and have a chat. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Jaume.